Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale with a real special episode for you guys. I had the privilege to sit down with Woody. You guys know him as the leader of Reddit Alpha. He's also a frequent poster on the Reddit subforums for Clash Royale, and he's just a real big influencer in the community. He's also an Expo/Mortar, basically an all-around Siege pro player. So what I did was I had the opportunity to talk to him, and we discussed a variety of topics, starting with his visit to Finland. He actually just got back from Helsinki in Supercell headquarters, where he talked with the game developers, giving them feedback from the community, and there's really no better guy to touch base with than Woody. So we're going to talk to him about that. We're going to talk to him about the most and least popular cards in the game and why they're the best and the worst of the current meta. We're also going to go ahead and end this episode with some pro tips for Expo and Mortar players who just are maybe trying to start to get into the archetype and want some beginner tips. So that is what's in store for you guys today. So sit back, crack open a beer, a coffee, or a soda, and enjoy the interview, guys. Alright guys, so I am here joined by none other than Woody. He is the stat master of Reddit, posts bi-weekly updates on the most and least popular cards in the game. Today I decided to invite him on to really talk about why these cards are popular and what we can kind of glean from the information even if we're not a top ladder player. So first of all, Woody, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thanks very much for having me, Ash. It was a pleasure meeting you out in California. I'm a big fan of the channel, and I look forward to talking about all these cards.
I know. Thank you, man. I appreciate it, and it was great meeting you, too. Certainly, I've talked to you a lot beforehand, but it's great putting a face to a name, and you did really well in the King's Cup. You made it to the final heat, did you not?
That's right. Yeah, I was, I think, number 25 at the very end. Didn't quite make it on stage, but had a blast. And I think I did pretty well, running mostly an Expo deck.
Yes, you're very well known for the Expo, and we're going to get to that in just a bit. But first of all, I just wanted to talk, before we get into the list, I know that you just came back from Helsinki, Finland, visiting Supercell HQ for the first time. Do you have any takeaways from that? How was it?
Man, it was an awesome trip. I've been involved in the Clash Royale community since basically the first day of soft launch with the Reddit clans, and have just continually been impressed by the level of community involvement, and getting to meet the team in Finland was an absolutely amazing experience. I imagined it for weeks leading up to the experience, what it was going to be like, and pretty much every single expectation was met or exceeded. It was pretty cold there, but besides that, the warmness of and generosity of all the devs that I got to meet, and speaking with them about the current meta game and where the future of Clash Royale is headed was a lot of fun, and I have great hopes and aspirations for the game, and am renewed in my spirit for Clash Royale.
That's so good to hear, man. Is there anything is there any advice? Is there any tips or any feedback is the word I'm looking for? Any feedback that you gave them that you can share with us?
Sure. I think that it's really important that players are able to identify with certain cards, develop their skills with them, and be able to play them in pretty much any metagame. I think that balancing is one key aspect of that, to make sure that whatever card you want to play, you've got a role for it. And one thing that I hear a lot from people is, what's the best card right now? What's the best deck right now? And so that's one of the reasons why I developed these card popularity snapshots. But even though no one is using Mortar at the top of the ladder right now, I still use it, and I have a lot of fun with it. So my advice to everyone is, if you have a favorite card that doesn't rank really highly in the popularity snapshot, or you don't see the pros using it, doesn't mean that it's not a great card, and doesn't mean that it won't become a great one, even after another round of balancing updates. So play the game to have fun, and if you wind up winning a tournament or two here or there, it's just icing on the cake.
That's definitely a great point. It's always good in a game that evokes such strong emotions. It's always good to remind yourself that it is a game, so have fun. So good point. Before we get into the actual numbers and everything that you put out, which is really just a total wealth of information, I kind of wanted to ask maybe for some clarification on what these numbers actually mean. And first of all, you compiled this list that we're looking at. I'm going to link that in the description, guys, if you want to check this out. You're definitely going to want to check this out. Probably open it up while you're listening to us talk. But the list that you compiled today has a list of, it's all the information is aggregated from the top 100 players on ladder play. Now, is there anything that tournament players or, people in mid to low level arenas, free-to-play players can glean from this information as well?
Absolutely. This list is obviously perfectly designed for the people at the top of the ladder to know which cards they're using, which ones are really popular in the metagame, which ones might be overpowered, which ones are really versatile or just particularly good in the current metagame. But it's also useful for anyone, going on down the ladder into tournaments. It's not a perfect reflection of the cards that you would want to be using in your deck, but it's a pretty good indicator of if you had every card and you were one of the most skilled players in the world, which cards are you including in your deck? And so that's what the list reflects, essentially.
Yeah, I really like the list too because, if you're even me personally, if I'm my deck's pretty good. I like it. My go-to deck that I've been playing this balance update in the current meta. And it's good though. It's a good exercise to look at your list and then maybe think about some card substitutions based on what's successful in the actual game, So I'm actually going to go through the list now and maybe thinking about, subbing out like a knight for Ice Golem or something like that, just it's kind of a good exercise, like I said, to go through there and maybe just, spark some new ideas. So why don't we get to the actual list? And the three cards that came at the top in terms of popularity are the, to no one's surprise, Mega Minion, the Log, and Zap, with archers coming in right behind at number 4. Can you tell us why those cards remain so popular, and have they always been popular, or is it really more since the current meta that they really took that rise in popularity?
It's a great question. I think that there's three key factors that influence the popularity of a card. First, it's versatility. If you can use a card in a lot of different situations, you're more likely to see that card than one that requires a very niche use case. The second is whether or not the card is just overpowered. If its stats are really good for its cost, you're going to see it a lot more often than a card that just doesn't work well in a lot of situations. And then the third thing is it good in the current metagame? If a card is hard countered by another one that is really popular, you're not very likely to see that one. So with the top 4 cards here that you identified, the ones that are used in more than half of all decks at the top of the ladder,
Crazy.
Mega Minion, the Log, Zap, and Archers, pretty much all 4 of those meet all 3 of those criteria in terms of versatility, good stats, and good in the current metagame.
Absolutely. Could you give us maybe like a 5-10 seconds on each of those cards and tell us maybe why? I know you did that in your write-up, but maybe to just tell folks who haven't read it yet.
Absolutely. Mega Minion is resistant to all spells. Basically, you have to spend at least 6 elixir on a spell if you want to kill the Mega Minion. It does a lot of damage both to single targets and to big groups of enemies, and it can't be hit by melee troops, so very useful in a lot of situations. The Log, or as I spelled it, the L-O-G-G, is very, very good also right now. It was recently buffed so that it rolls faster, farther, and for more damage. It is even higher than the very versatile Zap, and I think that's because of its low cost, its high damage, and the popularity of ground-based attacks right now. Lava Hound decks haven't really been quite as successful at the top of the ladder, and so the Log is still useful both against kind of small chip damage-oriented decks and against kind of some of the bigger tanky ground-based decks. Next one is Zap. So Zap isn't used quite as much as the Log, but it's still very popular. It's able to hit air troops. It's able to reset the targeting of any troop or tower in the game, so works very well with big troops like the Golem and Giant when you need to reset an Inferno tower, and it also instantly hits whatever target it's aimed at, so you can play it on your opponent's side of the arena, unlike the Log. So Zap gets a lot of value, and then the last card that's used in more than half of all decks is Archers. It works very, very well against Graveyard. Some people have started to realize recently. It's resistant to spells also. Zap, arrows, and the Log aren't enough to kill the Archers. You really have to upgrade to Poison, which isn't hardly used at all, or a Fireball, which can be difficult because a lot of players will split the Archers behind their King Tower and go for both lanes. So all four of these cards, very versatile, very good, and work well in the current metagame.
Yeah, and we talked about, actually, before we started recording, we talked briefly about, what this list actually means, and it's important to note, probably, and point out for people, it may be a little bit obvious too, but just because these cards, are the top 8 cards, doesn't mean you should put all 8 of those cards in your deck. The win condition cards, it seems they tend to be a little bit less popular because you really only need 1 or maybe 2 in a deck.
That's right on point, and that's one of the reasons why I include the suggested deck lists. Just because all these cards are very popular doesn't mean that they go well together. In a lot of cases they will, but it takes a little bit more of an artistic side to put a deck together rather than just kind of the scientific number grinding that we get from the popularity snapshot.
Exactly. Now, the biggest decline in popularity seems to be the Golem, which is kind of surprising. It seems like I still see a lot of Golem out there, but it's followed by the Baby Dragon and the Lightning. Any insight as to why those three? I mean, part of it, I'm sure, is because they were so popular that naturally they see a big decline because they were, they seem to be in every deck for a while there. But any further insight into why we're seeing a little bit less Golem, Baby Dragon, and Lightning?
Of course, anytime a deck becomes really extremely popular in the metagame, even if the cards themselves are a little bit overpowered, you will see that deck a little bit less often as players become accustomed to countering that. So that could be one potential explanation. Another is the fact that the previous time that I pulled the snapshot was from under tournament rules at the King's Cup. And I think that really big cards like Golem tend to work better under tournament rules where you have 2 additional minutes of double elixir overtime to make that big push finally happen. And those 3 cards are quite often seen in the same deck together. The Golem, Baby Dragon, Lightning cards all work extremely well under tournament rules. And if you're able to make that big push happen, they will obliterate your opponent. But on the latter, it takes a little bit longer to build that up. Sometimes players want to go for more of a chip damage-oriented style with more control elements in their deck that doesn't tend to lean toward how Golem players play their decks.
So the biggest gainers are Bowler, Giant, and Hog Rider. So interesting to see the Golem kind of losing a little bit of steam and the Giant gaining a little bit of steam after the Giant was, back in the Goizen days, the Giant was absolutely everywhere. Excuse me. Why do you think people are switching from the Golem to the Giant?
I think that the switch partly has to do with the fact that on ladder you have 2 minutes less of overtime to work with, but the Giant also in some ways can counter a Golem. You're both putting a lot of hit points on the table in terms of the elixir that you spent, but with the Giant, you have 3 additional elixir to throw into support troops to make a big push happen, perhaps splitting onto the opposite lane. Puts a lot of pressure on a Golem user to be able to try to counter it, especially because Golem decks often use things like Baby Dragon and Archers that have difficulty taking down a big Giant that's played at a relatively highly statted, big body for only 5 elixir.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. In having that 1 minute overtime versus 3 minutes overtime, definitely a factor that you got to, kind of keep in mind. Would you expect to see, the tournament cards when you did the tournament standings 2 weeks ago? Was it a big difference in terms of card variety that you see on ladder play, or was it pretty much the same?
There's a fair bit of difference in there. Cards that are really good in every setting will still be really good regardless of whether it's tournament rules or ladder. The Mega Minion, for instance, had 86 appearances under tournament rules and only 84 on the ladder. Yeah. So not a big drop-off there. Typically cards that will get chip damage or kind of guaranteed damage on the enemy tower, like a Miner, spells tend to do rather well under tournament rules, as opposed to the ladder in which you, once again, have less time to get that tower down, and so you really kind of need to rely on a bigger assault or, maybe a more tricky line of attack, as we saw with the rise of Hog Rider.
Absolutely. So the current dead cards right now, or the cards at the very bottom with no appearances on the list, are Wizard, Witch, Valkyrie, Sparky, Rage, Prince, Poison, and a few others. So do you think all these cards are... Or do you think any of these cards are underrated right now, or do you suspect that they all maybe are in need of a buff?
Almost across the board, they need a buff.
Yeah.
There are some that are particularly bad in the current metagame. What I'm thinking mostly of are things like Valkyrie, cards like, I guess... Right. Sparky, not just in the current metagame, it's kind of bad overall because it's very easy to get the reset on there.
Yeah.
So Sparky just has a whole host of difficulties apart from that. But yeah, cards like Wizard, very overcosted for what they're able to do. They can take out hordes very well, but you don't see a whole lot of swarmy type gameplay. And even the decks that are kind of running a swarmy type element to them will probably have a counter for the glass cannons, we call them, the troops that deal a lot of damage but don't have a whole lot of health, like the Witch, like the Wizard, like a Musketeer. And as it happens, Lightning, which is very popular in the current metagame, we saw in almost half of all decks, will kill a Wizard outright. Will kill a Musketeer outright. Yeah. So those are two troops that are very good under the right circumstances, but that find difficulty getting the value that you need out of them to justify the big elixir investment.
Yeah, I'd really like to see a buff to, especially Wizard. I mean, poor Wizard's basically never been in the meta, Like, it's maybe in the very beginning, but Wizard doesn't get a lot of love. For 5 elixir, I don't know. You always have a better option out there, it feels like. But, moving on to your deck list that you suggest decks based on these cards, and it's actually a good tool to kind of supplement the raw data that you provide. And I wanted to kind of zero in. We don't have time to talk about every single one of the decks that you suggest on this post, but can you talk a little bit about the Expo Bowler deck that you shared? I mean, you're well known in the community, as I mentioned earlier, for being, really an almost exclusive Siege player, and you're really good at it, as evidenced by the King's Cup and, many other tournaments and your streams. Can you talk a little bit about an Expo Bowler deck and maybe just give some basic introduction tips for someone who isn't normally an Expo Siege player?
Absolutely. So I love playing Siege decks. I've been running them since basically the start of the game. This Expo Bowler Siege deck was actually used by Supercell, a variant of it was at any rate, in the King's Cup in-game challenge. So it's kind of acknowledged as one of the ways of playing Siege that's very popular. It was very successful in Super Magical Cup. When it first came out, people were having some difficulty kind of figuring how to counter it. The reduction in cost of Bowler down to 5 made it a lot easier to supplement the Bowler with additional win condition cards that could just kind of make a big push that was difficult to counter with any setup that was used at the time. So what we see here, there were 3 appearances of the Expo Bowler archetype in this past snapshot. My recommendation would be to think of it along the lines of like a giant deck. For most of the game, you want to be setting up your defensive units, kind of trying to make positive elixir trades, as my good friend Yarn would put it, and just gaining an elixir advantage so that when you do finally have the opportunity to drop a Bowler in one of the lanes, to deflect a Hog Rider or to try to get rid of some archers or a small attack from your opponent, as the Bowler is walking in that lane toward the enemy tower, you drop an Expo really nearby. Now, if they have Rocket, they can kind of hard counter you and just destroy your entire setup. But if they don't, that's a pretty big push. 11 elixir invested, where you have a big body out in front, the Bowler, the soak hits from your opponents. You have a lot of splash damage from the Bowler. You have that knockback effect, and the Expo added on there presents a timer for your opponent. Essentially, they have 4 seconds to get something on the field and distract the Expo and then take it out as soon as possible. And if they can't do that, a lot of times they'll lose a tower. So I really like playing Siege. It's a very chess-like approach to Clash Royale, in my opinion. You have to think several steps ahead of your opponent, try to predict their plays. So this Expo Bowler Siege deck works particularly well in double elixir overtime. It's quite difficult actually to build up the push that you need in the first couple of minutes of the game. But if you're patient and you make the right plays early on, and you don't suffer too much of a beat down from your opponent with like a Golem or a Royal Giant or a Giant-based deck, this Expo Bowler deck can work very well. And I encourage your viewers to check it out if they're interested in Siege. Give it a try, and I hope they have success with it.
Yeah, any common mistakes as far as specifically revolving around the Expo and when to play it and when not to play it? Like, are you basically cycling to it as fast as possible, or are you being more patient and strategic in terms of when you're playing it?
That's a great question, and I would say that patience really is a virtue when you're playing a Siege deck. You've got to get almost an ideal setup if you want to make the connection that you need with your opponent's tower. A big mistake that Expo and Mortar players will use right when they switch to the archetype is to try to cycle through them as quickly as possible, like it was a Hog Rider or something, to try to get your opponent out of rotation and just get that connection that you need as soon as possible. What you often find is it doesn't work. Your opponent will realize that they're playing against a siege deck and will adapt to prevent you from getting that connection that you're looking for. It takes 4 seconds to lock onto the tower, and so you're not really going to be getting much of a surprise factor against them. The best way to get that damage in is to make sure that you have an elixir advantage, or if you're not able to get one, that at least you have a big push to support and defend the Expo or the Mortar. And I would say that one of the other key mistakes that players will often make is throwing too much elixir on the board or trying too hard to commit to an Expo or a Mortar that's been damaged already.
Just know when to let it die.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to, start off with maybe an Ice Golem, maybe an Ice Spirit or something really small out in front to distract and give you an opportunity to respond to whatever your opponent plays against the Mortar or the Expo. But kind of once you see it, you need to make a really quick judgment call. Is this something that I can take down, and can I keep this Expo alive and drill through and get some damage on tower? Or if I overcommit in defense of the Expo, am I going to wind up losing my opposite lane? Because the 6 elixir investment solely for offense is pretty big in the Expo. So
I like it though. I mean, I'm not an Expo player myself, and I'll tell you I'll ask you a question about one of those reasons why in just a sec. But it is a cool card. I think the game needs more, and I love the fact that there are these pure offensive cards like this, because really, I think offense. Well, I think it's a no-brainer. The offense drives the game, so I like that. I like that Siege is an archetype in the game. But the question I had for you is, one of the reasons that kind of scares me about Expo is if you lose a tower first, it seems like an almost, monstrous task to try to make the comeback with an Expo being your win condition, at least to me. Any tips for if you lose the first tower? How do you do? Because obviously, especially if you're going against the tower in the lane that you lost a tower, it just seems really difficult to actually mount a comeback because the opponent can, counter your Expo directly on your Expo if you try to go for that same tower. So do you shift lanes? How does your gameplay change when you're down a tower first?
That's a great question, and this is something that applies almost equally to Mortar decks. Whenever you're playing Siege, there's a lot of mind games that go into trying to force your opponent to play on one lane or the other. Of course, your question was about once you've already lost a tower, what to do, but I think that it's instructive to think about before that, how did you lose that tower in the first place?
Yeah.
And to try to, if you're down 500 hit points on one tower relative to the other, start playing your Expos in the opposite lane. Start playing your Mortars in the opposite lane to force them to play troops in that lane to try to kill the Expo or the Mortar, right? One of the great advantages that you have in playing offensive cards like Expo or Mortar that stay on your side of the arena is that you can dictate both the tempo and the lane in which the combat is taking place. So if your opponent is clever or, you make a mistake, they might be able to drill through that and still take one of your towers down. At that point, you are going to be really, really hard-pressed to take down the tower in your opponent's lane if you've already lost your tower in that lane. So I would almost every single time switch and try to take down the opponent's tower on the other side of the one that I still have up.
Yeah.
If you are in a situation where it's like a 1-1 draw and you've kind of split like caddy corner, towers have been taken down, you can actually play your Mortar or your Expo in the center of the arena right next to the river. And this is actually something that I'll do quite often against Hog Rider decks to try to force them to spend a lot more time in the center of the arena where they're being hit by my towers, and I have more of an opportunity to finish them off. But when you have an Expo or a Mortar set up in the middle, unless your opponent has something like a cannon or a Tesla or an Inferno tower to kind of burn that offensive building down really quickly, it can present kind of a difficult decision for them regarding, do I want to try to take that Expo or Mortar down, or do I want to try to go for the next tower in the sequence? And so it can sometimes catch people off guard. They don't often see Expos and Mortars placed directly at the river, and if they have any ranged troops, those also work really well. against that sort of placement, but I think that's one of the only tools that you really have in your toolbox to take down an opponent's tower once you've already lost yours on that side.
Yeah, that's actually some really solid advice there, and I like how you compare it to a chess match, and it's cool. You always have to kind of think 1 or 2 moves ahead of your opponent. So before we wrap things up today, can you let folks know where they can find themselves some more Woody?
Absolutely. I'm the leader of Reddit Alpha. We're a global top 50 clan, and we have our subreddit, r/CR Reddit Alpha. I'm also really active on the main Clash Royale subreddit, and I have also started streaming recently. I'm on Twitch. WWoody123 is my Twitch username, and it's the same here on YouTube. So I just want to thank you so much for bringing me on your channel. I've been a longtime fan, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to talk with you about something that I'm really passionate about and care a lot about, and that's Siege gameplay in Clash Royale. And so, yeah, I appreciate your time, and thanks for having me on.
I appreciate you coming on, man. And guys, it will really, trust me, you won't regret checking him out. I'll include all the links to his Twitch, his YouTube, and Twitter. Do you mind if people hit you up on Twitter, maybe ask you some questions or some follow-up questions that I probably didn't cover in this video?
Absolutely. I'm at Woody_CR, and I've got my DMs open as of the time of this video. So would be happy to answer any questions and talk about Siege gameplay.
Well, Woody, thank you so much. You're a total bastion of the community, and it's just been a total pleasure to have you on. Really appreciate all the work you do for everybody in this community. So thank you again, man.
Thanks very much.
So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Woody, definitely a wealth of knowledge. Make sure you show the guy some love on Twitch. I'll be sure to include the links to his Twitch and Twitter in the description below, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.